Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Stephen Gilchrist and I'm lecturer of Indigenous art and the Deputy Director of the Power Institute. And it's my great pleasure to moderate this session, which is really focused on Djalkiri, the Yolŋu art collaborations and collections, which is the wonderful exhibition and catalogue at the Chau Chak Wing Museum at the University of Sydney. I'm joined by a great distinguished guest, Djon Mundine, Bernice Murphy, Matt Pohl, Rebecca Conway, and Gerald McMaster, and I'll be introducing our great speakers in a moment. As I said, I'm lecturer of Indigenous art, and I share a deep commitment to making visible, audible, and tangible the Indigenous knowledge that is embedded in and safeguarded through place. And so I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal people on whose customary lands I'm now on. I pay my respects to the Gadigal people. This place was named by the Gadigal, for the Gadigal, and because of the Gadigal, and who have been keepers and couriers of this knowledge. This is the first of a series of events that the Power Institute is developing this year called Linework, Networks, Lineages and Crossings of Indigenous Art. And through this series, we're really wanting to rethink some of the lines that have perhaps delimited the understanding of Indigenous art and culture. And so we have some great information on our website. And the goal of the series is really to explore this history of Indigenous line work, from the specific techniques of line drawing that express Indigenous philosophies of self and community, to the methodologies of storytelling and network building that connects Indigenous people to moments in history and to other Indigenous people in Australia and around the world. So we'll be presenting lectures, conversations with artists, curators, and scholars, including Julie Nagum, Jonathan Jones, Kimberly Moulton. But today we're going to be thinking about this exhibition, Djalkiri History of Djalkiri, at the University of Sydney. And I thought I would begin by introducing Djon Mundine and Bernice Murphy, and to get us thinking about the history of Indigenous art within institutions. So although Bernice and Djon require no introduction, Djon is a Bundjalung man from the Northern Rivers of New South Wales. He's a foundational figure in the history and criticism of Indigenous art and culture, and has held senior positions at the National Museum of Australia, the Museum of Contemporary Art, the Art Gallery of New South Wales. And in 1993, Mundine received the Medal of the Order of Australia, and in 2020 won the Australian Council's 2020 Red Ochre Award for Lifetime Achievement. Bernice Murphy was the first curator of contemporary art at the Art Gallery of New South Wales, then committed for 15 years in various roles to the development of the Sydney University's Power Collection, and finally becoming the second director of the MCA in the late 1990s. So thank you for all of our guests, and particularly Bernice Murphy, who I want to begin. And I have this beautiful slide of you, Djon, in the 1980s. And I was wondering if you could start by talking about how your relationship began with Yolŋu communities in Arnhem Land.
Yes, thanks, Stephen. Thank you all, and thanks to the Gadigal people on land, whose land we stand, and any other Aboriginal people that are listening in or watching this broadcast. Their problems are the problems of my family's problems. They are the problems of all Aboriginal people. Their joys are also the joys of all Aboriginal people. I came to this in a crazy way, in a sense. Originally, in the 70s, I was attempting to get into university and do those kinds of middle-class things that Aboriginal people were being pointed towards, to get a Bachelor of Arts degree or whatever. And funnily enough, how it all turned out with universities, I was actually studying to be an accountant Now, it's such a curious thing, counting numbers. Of course, in today's university, I'd thrive, of course, given the funny nature of universities now with money concerns and profit making rather than intellectual rigor. Anyway, I happened to come upon a position in a company called Aboriginal Arts and Crafts in the mid-1970s in Sydney. It was a company set up by the Australia Council for the Arts. The Australia Council for the Arts took over, which was initiated or brought into being really formally by the Whitlam government in the early 1970s. And they made sure that one of the boards that was constituted the Australia Council, there was a literature board, there was a music board and a visual arts board, but there was an Aboriginal arts board. And they set up two measures to try to bring things into light for the Australian population and the world at large, of course. And that was to attempt to break into a fine art market, well, more than a market in money terms, but also in social values and intellectual readings of Aboriginal life, Aboriginal ways of being, and Aboriginal visual art. Now that's it's such a really great task and horrendous task for them to take that on in the early 1970s. And I think a mark of how this, how far they were behind the eight ball, as they say, what a task it was. In order to get that name, Aboriginal Arts and Crafts, that name was actually, had already been, what do they call it? It had been registered by a non-Aboriginal person. So in order to use that name, they had to buy that name off a non-Aboriginal person. So I came to work there and I was given a role. I was called a manager. And as a manager, I was an operations manager, which basically meant I was the storeman and packer for this company. And I employed two other men to work with me from who were local Aboriginal people, or they were living in Sydney at the time. Michael Leslie, the dancer, came to act as a storeman and packer, and another man called Johnny Barker, whose family is a very famous family from the northwest of New South Wales. The company was set up to market art from largely remote communities. The idea of urban Aboriginal art largely was non-existent in those days. We talk about post-colonial art, post-colonial thought, that was non-existent. But I came to interact with Yolŋu people from Arnhem Land in that period. I was hanging their art and receiving their artwork, packing it to go to other places, and talking to people. And even in those days, though, there were trainees from those communities that came to work in that company in Sydney during that time. It's the time when the film The Last Wave, Peter Weir's film, was being made. So we got to see people like David Gululu turned up in that into that gallery, and people like that. The Mornington Island Dance Group would turn up and perform there. So I got to meet lots of people from remote communities and from remote positions in the art world. And by remote, I mean in particular, specially thought through positions, counter positions in the Western art world. And one of those was Bernice Murphy, who used to bring guests, international guests, into the gallery to have a taste of seeing Aboriginal art. They didn't have to travel to Alice Springs or to Arnhem Land. They could see a massive array of art from all over Australia. So when I left this company, I went to take a position in Malungi. That's what I thought. I have to get back to a very traditional living, traditional speaking Aboriginal community to find the essence of everything. If there was an essence to being Aboriginal, I wanted to see that, and I wanted to find myself, of course.
And can you remind us what year that was, John?
That would have been in the late 70s. 79 was when I actually took the position. The beginning of 79 is when I took the position. I applied for a position at Meningrida the year before, 78 or 77 or 78, which was someone else, Peter Cook, who lived there, took the position up, took up a position. He was too difficult to explain now, but he took that position up and went on to do really great things. I applied then for the Malungi position, and they told me, oh, well, we've got somebody lined up for this, but the community did. But unfortunately, they hadn't told the people they'd lined up. And so then when they asked these people, well, can you take this job? They had no interest at all in taking the role. So I was given about 2 weeks or something to pack my bags, to make the decision, tell my parents, tell my family, and pack my bags with whatever I could carry and take off to Malungi in January 79. Yeah.
And after how many years did you start to receive invitations about assembling different kinds of collections that were essentially community collections? Did that start with you and Bernice having discussions?
Yes, thanks, Stephen. Essentially, up till that time, exhibitions in Sydney were just the month's collection, community's production or output would be put together and sent to the place in Sydney, and we would have an exhibition of Owen Pelly art, or we'd have an exhibition of Malungi art, etc. And that's how I proceeded for the first couple of years. The company's galleries, there were 6 of them, would send me orders and say, look, we need 20 small suitcase size bark paintings. There was that size sort of condition, etc. I had a really peculiar request to have, could I produce 100 didgeridoos for a particular customer that never really eventuated. We did produce, I don't know, maybe 50 before the buyer became disinterested. So it was like that. But after I'd say about 3 years, I decided to be more proactive and put exhibitions together around ideas, etc. And that came, in about in the early 1980s is when that came, 81. I produced a very large exhibition of several hundred art objects that included not only paintings and sculpture, but bags and woven material, fiber work, fish traps, etc., and jewelry, ornamental objects. And that went into a huge exhibition in Brisbane, still in the Anthropology Museum of the Queensland University of Queensland, but it was a broad range of objects. And basically that told me not to make that that division between craft and art. Everything was art. I decided, and I also decided that this exhibition, The Land, the Sea and Our Culture, the exhibition from the people of Malungi and Remengining, which had just actually came into being, they that this was a division that the exhibition had to be around ideas rather than particular art forms. It was more about ideas. And in that time, I came to visit the Art Gallery of New South Wales. I was travelling back and forth originally between Sydney and Remengining, Malungi. And I went there, and they said they were trying to put on a large exhibition of their bark painting collection, which is something like 200 bark paintings at least that they had in their collection. And that, again, which is a marker of the times, was that it's a rumour, there was a very big rumour that the art gallery administration was going to move those bark paintings out of that collection, that they didn't see Aboriginal art as art with a capital A, and they were going to hand them over to the Australian Museum and divest themselves of those pieces. And I happened to wander into the middle of that discussion, debate, argument, and they said, I said, well, I'm living at Malungi. And they said, you're the perfect person to come here and put this show together, which is what I did. There's no publication because I was living half between Malungi and occasionally coming down to direct this exhibition. So that's really when I was bumping up against, again, with Bernice, who then sort of noticed that that's where I'd went to Malungi. And she, that was in 1983. And she then, we then had a number of meetings and conversations, and decided that could I put together other groups of art objects around ideas or about concepts of Aboriginal life.
And if I could skip ahead to this slide that we have, and was this the first collaboration that you and Bernice worked on? Perhaps this is a question for both of you.
There was one, Bernice will speak for herself, but there was, Bernice is the person which no one seems to realise who actually invented the word perspector, which is a play on a Latin word about perspectives. And she put that together at the Art Gallery of New South Wales, partly against to bring contemporary art really into the Australian contemporary art, into the Australian art and Australian world consciousness of that Aboriginal Australians were making contemporary art, and Aboriginal art should be seen as part of that contemporary art world. So she invented, and I'm sure she'll say this herself, she conceived of this idea of in between the Biennale of Sydney in the other years, between the years of the Biennale of Sydney, which was about international art, there would be Perspecta, which was an exhibition about Australian art, Australian contemporary art. That it was seen that Australians were making contemporary art. We were making contemporary art. We were, we were beyond this mutually exclusive term, Australian intelligentsia. There was an Australian intelligentsia, and we didn't have to always wait for people from overseas to tell us what to do. or what
Yes.
hairstyle to wear, or whatever, or what fashion was in vogue in these other places. So that fitted in. So I put together two ideas. One was a group of paintings and objects around the idea of taxonomy, the taxonomy of honey, of native bees, native honey, and how that species, that thing, that wonderful thing, honey, was conceived of or illustrated by the people of Malungi and Ramingining. And the other was about a native title claim, a land claim, and in fact a sea claim is what it was. And there was a legal court case about the offshore waters off Malungi and Ramingining and the Glide River estuary, about protecting those waters from fishermen just coming there and vacuuming all the fish. That they would have Aboriginal people would have a legal standing to keep those people out, or to come to arrangements and mediate the amount of fish that were taken or where they fished, etc. David Malungi, whose work had appeared on the dollar note, one of the paintings, a composition that he made, appeared on the Australian $1 note. He produced a series of paintings about sacred sites, some of which were in the water, out in the water. They were also along the actual coastline, and that was put into that Perspector exhibition. A major painting and then smaller paintings for each of the sites that were involved, that were incorporated into that made up the large painting, the large map of the land. There are two things that were interesting to that. One was that we incorporated woven objects into that array of work. The other was one of the sons of David Malungi. I gave him a camera and what must have been one of the first Walkmans I'd ever seen. And I said, you just record anything you want, take photos of anything that you want, and we'll put that together as an artwork, as an installation that also was in that exhibition. Was a series of social life of those people, where they went, etc., and also an audio that went with it. And that was Jimmy Barnable, who's deceased now. Well, David Malungi, of course, is deceased too. But that also went into that. So that was an innovative thing at the time to allow an Aboriginal person to do that and see that as art, an audio-visual installation.
And thanks for that, John. And I was wondering if I could include Bernice and, ask her, what was the reaction at this moment in time, handing over cultural authority to Indigenous people to do exhibitions? What was the reaction at that moment? Oh, Bernice, you're just on mute.
Right?
Yes.
I should be right now. I'm happy that John has had the time to tell a long story and a lot of things that he doesn't normally talk about when he's giving other more focused lectures or discussions. I'll see if I can fit in economically, Stephen, but please guide me because you've got other people to bring in. I didn't know of that experience John had at let me first say, sorry, I was the first curator of contemporary art at the Archive of New South Wales, as Stephen did mention before. Context is important because we see so many changes as successfully achieved now, but it was a very precarious world if we go back to the late 70s. when I came back, it was my second time at the Art Gallery of New South Wales, the gallery was sort of poised to get rid of the Biennale. There was a great discomfort about it. And one of my first jobs was to secure that. But having secured the Biennale with a report to the board, my next task, as I saw it, was to secure Australian contemporary art. Now you have to realize it was not visible then. No state gallery had done any survey of contemporary art for 8 years. No contemporary Australian art of any kind. So I saw my task as needing to bring Australian art into dialogue with the international event of the Biennale, but secondly, and very importantly, to bring Aboriginal art into that space also. This was not really thought of at that time. Very quickly, the first prospector I curated had 63 artists, and a whole range of new forms of art, from the activist 70s that were now impacting at the beginning of the 80s, performance, video, conceptual art, all kinds of multimedia work as well. And I included 3 very large paintings from Papunya, which actually took the whole focus of that perspective. And I don't want to go into that now, but just to say that that was important at that time because the Papunya works were refused as Aboriginal art. But moving on, quite quickly, the Papunya, the Western Desert paintings on canvas works became so successful that I was aware with Djon and in my dialogues with him that already the equally important creatively evolving art, and with the longer history of public awareness in Arnhem Land, was being overshadowed. So that the new, very quickly advancing interest in the Papunya works, the Western Desert paintings on canvas, were relegating the great creative work of Arnhem Land to a background. Quickly again, I invited Djon. I was still the curator of the second perspective, 1983 now, and 82 artists. Both were huge exhibitions. But this time I did not want myself, even though I had negotiated with the Aboriginal Arts Board in the first case, I wanted curatorship by and for and speaking in the voices of Indigenous people to come into the exhibition. So I invited Djon, would he do discrete parts of the exhibition, but completely curated by him, which ended up in 3 versions. And that was tremendously important because it was really Djon's launch as a curator. And I think it was truly the first time a person of Aboriginal background had been invited to curate with total trust, no intervention, total trust. Moving on quickly to the occasion of now, when I was appointed, but not yet there, to the position of co-curator of the Power Gallery, I was going to arrive there in January 84, I was able at the end of 83 to say, Djon, here is a chance I would like to bring to you now, an invitation that I couldn't have done within the gallery. It wouldn't have been accepted. And I invited him to form a whole exhibition from Ramingining, where he then was, working with the community, and that exhibition would be totally accepted in the following year if he would agree to do it, which he did. And that begins the whole story and volume of works that you have in this exhibition. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you, Bernice. Thank you, Djon. And I guess this can be a question for the rest of us to have as an active thought, but what about this category of the contemporary that was more useful? Did it better suit Indigenous aspirations at the time, and maybe thinking about now as well? But thank you very much for providing us with that history. I was wondering if I could move on to Matt and Rebecca, who are the co-curators of this exhibition. So Matt Pole is assistant curator of Indigenous heritage collections of the Chau Chak Wing Museum, and also works on the repatriation project. Rebecca Conway is curator of ethnography and Macleay collections at the Chau Chak Wing Museum and has a background in Aboriginal Australian Pacific Islands archaeology and has worked with cultural collections for almost 30 years. So thank you for bringing this exhibition to life. I was wondering if Nicholas could help me with getting the slides up again. I was wondering if I could start by asking you, Matt, you know, this exhibition is a marker of, you know, old and new relationships. And it's perhaps a blueprint of the way Indigenous communities are now included in different aspects of curation, which is both the process and the outcome. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the role of consultation. You know, what is at stake in these consultations? What are some of the conditions that are necessary? What does it require? So if you could talk about that, that would be great.
Sure, thanks so much, Stephen, and calling in from Gadigal land today as well. Yeah, consultation with the Yolŋu communities is like one of the steepest learning curves I think I've ever been on. You know, not speaking Yolŋu is a real disadvantage in terms of having those really important conversations that you need to have. And so I guess our consultations in a lot of ways were about finding ways that letting the works speak for themselves, letting the community consultants that guided us really be hands-on in terms of how we incorporated their feedback. It's not about going up there with a checklist of we need an answer to this, yes, no, yes, no. Sometimes it's important to be incredibly open to discussion, to options that you didn't even think existed. So it was quite fortunate to visit Yirrkala twice and also cross paths with the Buku Lange Mulka Art Centre at the Darwin Art Fair, and also catch up with some of the artists and directors. I mean, the Buku Lange Mulka Art Centre is probably one of the most busiest art centres I've ever seen. They're making works on site. They have this really busy shop. There's a recording studio. There's people dropping in, showing screenings of films that they're making. In terms of art centres, it's just an absolute powerhouse, all happening there under the one roof. I mean, it must be incredibly tiring to go home at the end of the day, having just been, in the thick of so many different amazing art projects. I mean, I remember one time I was up there and I saw this beautiful painting being put on the artist was working on it out on the balcony outside. And then the next time I saw it, it was hanging in a prominent position in the Art Gallery in New South Wales. So when you actually see those both sides from that, it's a very privileged perspective. But I guess, so yeah, you can see in one of the slides there, it's a bit hard. You turn up with these folders full of pictures, and the paintings that I were working with were from 1946, 47. So the people I was speaking with, it was their grandparents and great-grandparents' generation. Not a lot of people were incredibly forthcoming in terms of, giving very detailed background stories, other than to sort of guide us in the sense of, yes, this is right, this is the way it goes. I think from this slide and possibly the next slide, if we can move forward to that one, you can see how a lot of the consultation work was actually done on the ground, the same way that the paintings that were made, like on the ground, flat like that. So it became a really important curatorial choice to be able to try and exhibit the works in that sort of perspective. Like where you see on the left there, where we're laying out those sheets of paper with the paintings, that's the 10 groups which comprise the layout of the exhibition. It's what goes next to what. Yalpi and Wannabe were just incredible in terms of their patience working with me and letting me have a bit of a, I just literally felt like the caretaker, really. They were walking around them. It's quite beautiful when you see them flat in the space too, was a real conscious choice to not put them up on the walls, not because they're not artworks, but because there's just multiple entry points into these paintings, and you sort of need to be able to see them from the side, from above, from a distance. But that exhibition tech outcome is basically just a representation of the consultation process as well. And, you know, there's not much you need to do. It sounds lazy as a curator, but these works actually curate themselves, you know, and when you see them, once you actually have that little bit of confidence that you've got some of the information right, it's just a matter of placing them in conversation with each other.
Yeah. And so how did that dialogue happen with, you know, going from a point of consultation to then, you know, perhaps co-curation? Was that, you know, a conversation that was had, or was it something just part of the process?
Yeah, I felt it important to sort of step back a lot. I mean, Wanapi and Yalpi are the curators in that sense. It was really important to sort of keep those assemblages together in the way that they worked with the artworks in that sense. Yeah, I think it's just when you let the community voice sort of be your protocol, and you learn when to be silent and when to step back. It's another thing that Djon taught me, working with him on different exhibitions over the years as well, to sort of, you know, let the process happen, even though it seems really scary at the start. And you're like, where is this going? You know, when you let the voice of community be as present as it can be, you can step back at the end of it and just sort of go, wow, okay, that actually, you know, it sounds unfair, but I learned something as well. And it's not about teaching me, it's just letting the works really teach, letting that, you know, the community authored voice come through.
And could you talk a little bit more about the logic of the installation? You have, yeah, the floor, well, the plinth-based works, and then works that are on plinths and on walls. You know, could you explain perhaps the premise of that installation?
Do you mean across the whole space? Because yeah, I actually,
yeah,
it'd be a great segue into Rebecca as well, because I only worked on the Yirrkala side. But there is a sort of a index that goes through it, in the sense of, you know, there's the colour scheme, which links the dhuwala Yirrkala. There's a general sort of east-west dimension across the exhibition space as well. And, you know, from Morning Star to Sunset Dreaming, there's all these sort of little dualities that exist that also help shape that decision process across the entire space. But the way that the Malungi parts and the Ramingining parts that Rebecca worked so closely with was quite fortunate, I guess, that we had such a large space in the Ian Potter Gallery to work with. You really need that sort of big scale room to let these works breathe almost, and to let them have that sort of space around them that they need.
Well, I was wondering if you could also talk a little bit about, yeah, a bit more about the dialogue between the 1940s works and perhaps work that's being produced now. You know, what is the relationship to material innovation?
Yeah, I mean, you know, that's one of the learning processes that came out of this particular exhibition as well. I mean, we sort of offhandedly refer to them as bark paintings, but when you're actually looking at the materiality of a lot of these works, there's also works on masonite and plywood. So when you can see one of our 1946-47 works here, which is actually wood from a dismantled radar tower that was based at Yirrkala, and then looking at a descendant of Mawara Gunibi Ganamba, who's practicing today, you know, using offcuts from the bauxite mine. You can see in 1946, as well as, you know, 2019, there's that real, it's not makeshift, but it's making art with what's available. And, you know, really showing that, you know, these were contemporary artists' way in that the materiality that they're choosing is not about making it contemporary art, but they're preserving these minaji, these designs. The design is more important than the material, I think is what I'm trying to say. And when you look at these lineages between artists down the generations, there's that sort of really creative streak that comes through really powerfully, whether you're looking at some of the oldest works that are in museum collections, like the ones that the old McClade collections, or, you know, the contemporary art that's being produced today. There's that, yeah, a really important thread that runs through that.
No, I love that openness to new ways of expression. Thanks, Matt. Rebecca, I was wondering if I could ask you to talk about this photograph by Dr. Djalkiri. And yeah, it's an incredible photograph, and how perhaps you and the museum have been shaped by his legacy in different ways. Oh, Rebecca, are you on mute?
Apologies. I've been working with collections and museums coming up to about 30 years. And one of the things that I have learned over time through many teachers is that collections are about relationships. Mm-hmm. They express relationships. And the collections that we've been working with span 100 years. And I think when you stand back and look at them and you work with them with Yolŋu scholars, you can see Yolŋu curating us from the very earliest instances of interaction. So yeah, we've been working with collections from as early as the 1920s. Matt talked about some of the works from the 1940s, and then coming forward to the Power collection, 1980s, that Djon Mundine was so integral in, and Bernice so integral in bringing forward, and then also contemporary artists. So really what I see when we're working with these collections is a lineage of collaboration and connection between Yolŋu and Balanda non-Indigenous researchers and collectors at the university, working in Arnhem Land, but also now down south and on Zoom. And in that regard, I'd just like to do a shout out to people from Malungi Art and Culture who I think are working and maybe watching this event with us today. I would like to acknowledge the generosity of their relationships with us. And for me, this started through the work of Dr. Djalkiri, who is a Yolŋu man of Leonara Miri status, so a learned elder in his cultural system, whose knowledge was recognised in the Western academic sense through an honorary doctorate from the University of Sydney. And this was part of his commencement of really close research work with the collections here at the University of Sydney, which started with photographs, but extended, so historic photographs from the 1920s, but extended into all the collections that we hold across disciplines, so museum, ethnography, art collection, archive, yeah, and bringing together or focusing us around the idea of Yolŋu being the professors, the doctors, the anthropologists, the curators, and I really acknowledge him as a mentor in driving a relationship that's come down to us today through other members of his Gupupungu family and clan, including his brother Joe Damanji and other members who collaborated with us on the current exhibition, which was very much, as Matt said, we didn't really see ourselves as curators, co-curators. Really, we were students of Yolŋu in terms of how they wanted to put the show together, how they wanted to present their culture to museum audience down south. Yeah.
And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the significance of the title. You know, what does Djalkiri mean for Yolŋu people, and what does Djalkiri mean as a curatorial device?
Okay, so as I said, we had some very early consultations where we importantly went to Arnhem Land and presented ourselves to people with our various folders of, lists of collections. And then we, working through the art centres, as Matt said, they're very actively producing work today. They're centres of elders with the expertise to work with these materials, have the right status and learning. We then brought people down to Sydney, like a core group of 6 elders, and they devised the title of the exhibition. So the title was theirs. It's
and do you want to explain what it means? Oh,
yeah,
sorry.
so Djalkiri is a very complex Yolŋu concept, but it has resonance with the idea of the footsteps of the ancestors, ancestral imprints on the landscape, and this idea of spiritual foundations. So what you see in all of the artworks that people are producing today and produced in the past is evidence of Wanga, of the ancestral beings, the Djalkiri. These are effectively the foundations of people's spiritual and spiritual life, understanding of the world, and their identity. So what the men wanted to do was to very generously, and Yolŋu are very generous people in sharing their knowledge with us. They wanted to say, hey, welcome, Gululu, welcome. Here it is, dhuwala, Djalkiri. So here it is. These are our foundations. Come and have a look. And in the university context, they were talking a lot about, these are our books, these are our essays, these are our theses on who we are, and this is how we put them together and want people to see them. Yolŋu language is very complex, and like as Matt said, we're working in a cross-cultural context where neither of us had the language skills to communicate with people directly in their own language. We did work with linguists and through people with much more expertise than we had in understanding or clarifying what sometimes people were telling us about the artworks and how they wanted them to be presented. But the whole show really was, from the title through to the arrangement of the works on the floor, was through a lens of Yolŋu philosophy. So the entrance to the exhibition is built around the concept of makarata. So if you go, the slide might not be here, but there's the entrance to the exhibition features contemporary work from 2016, a series of larakich or memorial poles that honour the Yolŋu clans at Malungi. And this was the pathway through which the men wanted people to enter the space. To acknowledge, so the makarata concept is a peacemaking concept or ceremony through which grievances are aired and deep discussions are had between two sides, and you find a way to work together to share an understanding and go forward together in peace or with a mutual understanding. So we had this makarata concept that you had to walk through at the start and understand. We then had what you see in the centre of this slide is one of the contemporary works we acquired from Yirrkala was a multimedia work in which the artist, Petrina Munagor, applies duck palm or white ochre to her face as members of her family sing a manakay, a ceremonial song in the background. And this was, the purpose was to make people stop and enter in seriousness and realise that they're entering a ceremonial space in which they're going to encounter very serious ceremonial concepts within the artwork. And then, as Matt explained, he worked with the men in the Yolŋu community, and I worked principally with the men from the community from Malungi and Ramingining through Djon and his historical relationship with people. And while they have slightly different ways of grouping the work, so the men from Yolŋu grouped the work mostly around ancestral narratives, and the men from Malungi and Ramingining grouped the work around clan identity. Effectively, they were performing a similar kind of form of representation. So through visual identity in the artwork, sort of the emblematic ways that clans represent themselves, and also the stories that those particular clans would carry. Sorry, I'm rambling.
No, I think it's a very important part of, the kind of the spatial arrangement of the exhibition, and also the concept behind it. And I think, it also helps us to maybe connect with the work that Gerald McMaster is doing as well, and thinking about the objects that, these are threshold objects. They open up ways of seeing, sensorial worlds. And then, I think, Gerald, perhaps you could talk about the work that you're doing at the Centre for Visual Knowledge at OCAD. And perhaps you could talk a little bit about how you landed on, this word of visual knowledge, which I think is quite powerful and, goes to what some of the other speakers have been saying about, Matt's essay is Barks are more than bark, how we can be open to different ways of seeing Indigenous art and culture.
Yeah,
so
thank you.
Gerald.
I hope I'm not muted, am I?
No, you're fine. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the question. Boy, I had, first of all, thanks to the Gadigal people. I wanted to, what I'm going to do is I'll just answer the question that you put out. And then I also wanted to put into context some of the discussions about maybe Canada, Australia, Canada and other parts of the world in a kind of global Indigenous context. So since we are talking it across from the ocean from one another, I thought maybe I would tell a story about a global Indigenous context into some of the projects in which we're working on at the present moment. So to begin with, I'm a director of the Wapata Center for Indigenous Visual Knowledge at OCAD University here in Toronto. I want to say it's very happy to be there in Sydney amongst the Gadigal people who I have met before, having been there a number of times in Australia. And I wanted to do a shout out to Mark Ledbury, who's a colleague of yours. I notice he's in the audience. Also, one of my research assistants here in Toronto, Nama, who I also see is online as well. So this notion of, and what you're talking about, and I think some of the discussion that is taking place today goes to the heart of an interest of mine and I think the research center. We're called the Wapata Center for Indigenous Visual Knowledge. We kind of coined the term because we thought about visual culture because that's what the program and the research center was once referred to as, the Indigenous Visual Culture Research Center. Then I did some research on this terminology of visual culture, and I realized it spoke a lot more about pop culture And I thought, well, if you're addressing Indigenous peoples, you're talking about stereotypes and those kinds of ideas, right, that are of interest to kind of audiences that are trying to do a critical and theoretical assessment of the kind of histories between colonizers and Indigenous people, for example. But what we were interested in was, is there an Indigenous way of seeing? And I've been in this industry for so many years, you know, that I've lost track. I've lost count how many years it was. But, you know, in my late stages of life and research, what I began to do was to think about going back home, back to the communities where I'm from, because as a youngster, I was raised in an Indigenous community. Of course, I was raised in the traditional language, the Plains Cree language. But over time, you lose that because you are indoctrinated into what we call the two founding nations languages, the official languages here in Canada, both English and or French. So you lose the Aboriginal language and you lose that whole sense of being. And until later, when I was a youngster out of university, I began to discover this very interesting field called Indigenous art. But it wasn't until more recently that, after kind of reflecting on those many, many years, I started to think, I want to give this research center a new name. Mm. And so I went back to the knowledge keepers from back home and old friends of mine. I said, I'm looking for this something sexy, you know, a real nice name for the research center, something about seeing and visuality and stuff like that. And they came back to me with this word, Ganawapatamawen, which means the condition of seeing. And they said it's about visual knowledge. And I thought, oh, that's cool. But up until now, I'd only heard about visual culture. I'd never heard of visual knowledge. I looked it up on the internet and online and couldn't find really anything that really hit home about that. And I was apprehensive about perhaps using that name because it meant I'd have to dive off the deep end of a diving board and into somewhere where nobody has been before. But I stuck to it and I said, well, let's use the term. So we used the short form of Ganawapatamawen to just wapata, which means to see. Mm-hmm. So as time rolled on and the kind of research we started to do and conduct, I said to my people, and each of the things that each of the projects we want to get involved in is to ask speakers, ask traditional folks, you know, the knowledge keepers and the elders, you know, ask them about the language, you know, give us the words and the nuance and the substance of the words about materiality and ways of seeing and thinking and all that. I said, we're getting tired of just, you know, because language, as we know, when we speak language, we perceive and conceptualize the world through language. And if we're only learning English, we're looking at from a Western point of view. And when we go to art school, and as all of you know, we go to art school, we're seeing from a Western point of view all the time. So I felt if we went back into the Indigenous visual languages, they might help us begin to think in a very different way. So I started out with my community language, which is Plains Cree or Nehiawan. And sure enough, when, for example, I was writing an essay, I was preparing an essay on drawing, and I was working on 19th century drawings of these warrior artists who, after battle, would draw their drawings in these small books called ledger, and they became known as ledger art. And what they were was they weren't imaginings. They were kind of truthful depictions of their battles. You know, the coup, when they went into battle, of course, coming back alive, if they can live to tell their tale. They couldn't just tell a tale because it had to be corroborated, right? It had to, you'd have to have a witness to say, he did that. I was there, I saw him do that. And so, you know, I went back and asked some of the community knowledge keepers, and I said, you know, when I was growing up, I always knew the term tapasneye, which means simply to draw. That was the translation I always knew. And I said, there's got to be a more nuanced understanding and translation of that word. And they came back to me and said, what it means is to make a mark in a truthful way. And that blew my mind. And I went to the Oxford English Dictionary, the ones that's probably on your bookshelf behind you there, Stephen. Went through, looked, boom, 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 all the connotations of drawing. And there wasn't one definition that said drawing in a truthful way or making marks in a truthful way. You know, I've been to Australia. I've been to those ancient rock drawings up in the northern communities, you know, where you guys have been. And, you know, those are truthful marks. Those are drawings made in a truthful way. And it had to be. And I think that that's, to me, those are the kind of things that begin to structure our way of seeing, and to think that if we're starting to, young artists and other people who are examining their communities, their culture, and wanting to know, is there an indigenous way of seeing? You know, is there a Haida way of seeing? Is there a Kriya way of seeing? And if you find, and if you ask those questions and you dig long enough, you're going to begin to find that there is, in fact, you know, when I saw some of the artwork that was being shown by Bernice, John, Matt, and Rebecca, I see that is making marks in a truthful way. You know, we can believe in artistic license. You know, there is artistic license, of course, but, you know, when we start to go back into our tribal languages, also, I was interested when you know, the translation down beneath on the our screen, and you were introducing Djon, and you introduced his tribal identification. I thought it was kind of funny. It said that he was a bunch of young men. That's what it said at the bottom. And I was going to say, he certainly is a bunch of young men. But anyhow, that was just kind of a bit of introduction to what I thought would address that question, and the question that we're all asking ourselves right now.
No, I thank you for that. And I was wondering if you could speak about this photograph as well, which I think is also about, you know, forms of Indigenous solidarity that aren't conflating togetherness with sameness, but are very interested in, you know, helping us to think about different ways of seeing things, you know, through an Indigenous lens. So I was wondering if you could talk about this project that you're working on.
Yes, seeking global Indigenous connections. And as I said, when I was in Australia, I was seeking an Indigenous connection between Australia and Canada. And I saw many, many connections. But I thought that I'd start back home. I'd start with the Indigenous Americas. You know, I thought I'd start with the Arctic and the Amazon. Now, these two regions, one is hot, one is cold, as you can see in the photographs. One is referred to as the refrigerator of the world, and the other is the lungs of the world. And of course, both regions have Indigenous peoples that have survived these areas for thousands of years and developed very, very sophisticated culture. And both have ongoing issues of colonization, whether it's Christianity, extractive technologies, pandemics today, for example, colonial creep, And of course, now the big issue that the entire globe is talking about is global climate change. The photographs that you see there come from a symposium we had a few years ago, back in September of 2019, in which the Research Center, which I direct, we organized an international symposium that brought together artists, curators, and academics from these two regions, indigenous folks, I should say. And as you can see the photographs, they're all playing it up at the conclusion of the symposium. They're having a good time. And the other image I took of the delegates at a local indigenous community. After the symposium, we took them to a powwow. And I don't know if you've ever heard of a powwow in Australia. You may have heard that more as a visual culture thing. But a powwow is like a social gathering that is practiced all over North America today. And, you know, there's singing and dancing. There's lots of eating, of course. And then a lot of artists are trading in their traditional art. So the artists some of the artists posed with some of the community elders that were there. You see the two elderly women. Certainly the smiles on their faces in both these images is indicative of the historic meeting and what it meant to have these two communities, these two regions, the Arctic and Amazon, come together. And, you know, when we thought of bringing them together, we thought only of the differences they might be expressing, but instead the opposite happened, because the days that everybody was together, they were only talking about the similarities, and that's what was expressed. And I think part of that global indigenous is not just, oh, we're different in this way and that way, but we are the same. There's something about us that is the same. So through this gathering, we started to formulate some ideas for an upcoming exhibition that we're going to be having in September of 2022. We talked about land relations. I think land relations is critical, of course, to all indigenous peoples and all over the world. Traditional knowledge, of course, is very critical. Indigenous ontologies. What does it mean to be from the land? What does it mean to be in relation with the land and all that's around? We also talked about contact zones, and what I just said, with outsiders who have come into the communities. But all of this was kind of framed in art activism, which I thought was kind of interesting. So this was a lead up to a major exhibition that we'll have in September of 2022 called the Arctic Amazon. And it'll be presented at the power plant in Toronto. And we're going to be having artists from Canada, the United States, and Scandinavia, the circumpolar Arctic, in relation to the Amazonian artists from Brazil, from Venezuela, and from Peru. Now, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of artists from these two regions. So we're not just going to have a catalog, an exhibition catalog, but we'll have a book. And I think we're going to we're bringing in writers from these two regions. We're going to be bringing many, many different kinds of artists. So we want to do a fuller project in a book form of these particular regions. So I just wanted to say, and I wanted to read something that I prepared, just a kind of in closing, a short text on this notion of global indigeneity, because I think it's part of it with your invitation of me coming there and the kind of things that you guys have been doing for many, many years on global indigeneity. Let me just say this. It is often said that global indigeneity is a movement that offers alternatives to claims of modernity, post-colonialism, and globalism. I certainly acknowledge that globalism and modernism have, in many instances, erased local differences by standardizing them into a single universal aesthetic. Yet in the Arctic Amazon project, we want to investigate whether global indigeneity might be a viable and affirming alternative, even perhaps a place of resistance to homogenizing and erasing forces and narratives. Our anti-colonialist hypothesis is that global indigeneity is where differences can be maintained in an international scale where personal, local, and community practices are valued and respected as international movements and norms are.
Thank you very much, Gerald, and thank you for all of the speakers today. I want to thank you for believing in Indigenous methodologies, but not more than that, enacting them in the work that you do. And so I want to invite questions from our audience, if that's okay. If people want to put their questions in the Q&A, we don't have any open questions at the moment, but perhaps people will start thinking about what are the active ideas that you want to explore further with our panelists who'll be with us for another couple of minutes. An interesting event happened this week. The Tate just acquired a bark painting by Djon Malungi, and that bark painting was actually hanging here in the Schaefer Library for a number of years. And so I was just wondering if I could ask the panelists about, some institutions have been perhaps have had a belated interest in Indigenous art, but is there something particular about, the materiality of bark that has made it more difficult to enter into these discussions about the contemporary? Perhaps, Djon, you might want to, you've been kind of insisting on this category of art without qualifiers for a really long time.
Yes, I think that it's such a curious thing in, it's such a queer thing in that people have always talked about, oh, we don't collect it because of its organic material. It's because of its primitiveness, the look of primitiveness about it, because of its durability, all these things that are totally hopeless to put that argument up in contemporary art is such a bloody ridiculous statement to make about things being, oh, we don't know how long we can keep it. We don't know how it looks primitive, or it's from the past, or it's from something else. Mm-hmm. Like that. People have so much photographic material, they have so much fragile material in contemporary art. In fact, a lot of contemporary art exists, or its aesthetic appeal is because of its fragility, that it's here and it may not be here, and so on. So I've been writing an essay for a German collector that I may actually finish in my lifetime, and I started with a song by Nina Simone where she talks about, she says, "Skin is skin, my skin is black," is the two words in the song that have been remixed by Jay-Z for another song. But he talks about the word for skin, and I found out that the word for skin in many languages is skin. Skin of a tree is the same as skin of a person. Skin is the outer covering of something, and that people. I still thought this idea that it was of a primitiveness that was the thing that they shied away from, rather than just accepting this miraculous creation about how people with nothing, a society that doesn't believe really in material goods, produces this thing that has actually become quite durable, very a finite, durable object, an art object. And in fact, it came into being in response to seeing Western art, seeing a regular space piece of sheet of material, so it looks like a Western painting. It looks like you can have. There aren't that many bark paintings that are regular squares. They're usually either landscape or portrait shapes. That they can be talked about in those terms. They can be talked about in many Western painting terms, but they can be talked about in lots of other ways. The thing about that I used to ask people with exhibitions, in fact, we were talking about language before. Gerald was talking about language and just the sound, the sonic, sensual nature of that, of how people say words. In fact, a lot of Aboriginal languages, when they talk about animals or birds, they're actually onomatopoeic words. So you're actually almost imitating the animal. You're imitating the sound of the animal, the bird, etc. But I'm drifting away from it. That at exhibitions, people quite often would come up to people from Remengining and ask them to give a direct description of what was in the painting. And I used to just say, some people spoke very good English, other people didn't. So I would say to them, can you sing this painting? And they would sing.
I saw that, I didn't buy it.
Hey?
Oh, really? Oh, well, it was in Coles and Woolies on special too. Oh, was it? Oh, really?
In the lead. Yeah. So they would sing the painting. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I think, does anyone else want to think about, obviously institutional representation has been really critical for Indigenous art as a platform for, thinking about, the more than visual. I don't know if anyone else wants to add any thoughts about, Gerald?
Yes, just before I answer the question, just let you know that that's amazing that John's work is being collected by a major institution as such. Here in North America, the Canadian artist Kent Muckman, who was in the Sydney Biennale in 2010, his work, a major work, was just recently purchased and put in the foyer of the Metropolitan Museum of Art last December, I believe it was. And so that was a big do there. But I wanted to, by way of answering your question, is to draw attention to the installation as you see, that's on our screen, and think of so much of Indigenous art from wherever it is, even in the Canadian Arctic of the region that I've been studying, or even in the Amazonian regions, or even in the desert paintings of Australia. This is the natural visual attitude of how work is created. It's not easel painting, so it's, as John was saying, it's not a landscape or portraiture that is put on your easel and then put up on the wall, but rather the way that these works were done was on the ground flat, and you look at it that way. There's no such thing as a horizon line or a perspective, but rather you see something from all sorts of angles. You taste it, you sing it into being, you turn it around and that, and the organicity is part of the art. It's not to live on forever. The songs and the stories is what carries these into being. So it goes almost against what museums are all about, who want to treasure these forever, whereas the artists continue to make these and produce these. And that's where the art is. And I think that's where these kinds of arguments and perspectives we have to start bringing into mainstream institutions, because they have to start understanding the perspectives of Indigenous, both Indigenous as well as historical Indigenous art.
Bernice? Oh, are you still on mute? Yep.
I'm just unmuting, is that right?
Yes.
Yes, I just wanted to add to remarks that John has made and Gerald, that it's important always to remember about art in Arnhem Land. It applies elsewhere in Australia, but especially in Arnhem Land. If you go to a place like Maningrida, I think it has one of the densest ratings of multilingual environment. So coming back to Gerald's ideas about knowledge centers and visual knowledge, the ways in which we learn as human beings is through our eyes and through acquiring language. So if we realize that we're looking at works from people who may speak 4 languages and English is added in, we're looking at ways of communicating even within communities that are enormously complex and subtle, because there might be 4 or 5 different linguistic versions of a concept, all with relationships, but all with particular differences. So a child may have this kind of highly active auditory learning environment and conceptual environment mediating their whole growth through the world. It's an extraordinarily sophisticated environment of knowledge acquisition and conceptual thinking. Thank you.
Thank you. Rebecca, did you want to add something?
I just was only going to pick up on a couple of things that have been mentioned in relation to the show and in reference to, oh, the light just went out here, Yolŋu art, is that I don't want to say the original impetus, but the ceremonial context in which a lot of these designs are produced are at the initiation or the dapi ceremonies for young boys. So these designs are painted on a young man's skin and absorbed into him through that process, but also, of course, through a period of instruction from elders. So yes, the metaphor of skin and bark is entirely apt in this circumstance, and the fact that they are painted onto a young boy's body lying down as well is another sort of reference that's happening through this style of display that the Yolŋu curators of this show were referencing. And I think this, working on this show was a fabulous experience. There were a number of challenges around mediating what was possible in terms of what the Yolŋu curators wanted to do and what we were able to achieve. So one of the things that we wanted to, what the curatorial team wanted to do was to have all of the songs, the manake, relating to each of the artworks, because as different people have mentioned, in this case, every painting has a song, every painting has an ancestral narrative, and one painting, song and ancestral narrative will link to another, and in that way links people together and people with the landscape and those stories that they, or spiritual beliefs that they come from. Yeah, so one of the ways that we're going to do that is through film. But we look at this picture and we don't hear any noise, but if we had a soundtrack, it would be a cacophony of songs emanating from each of these paintings or groups of paintings. Yeah.
If I can just say, paintings on the body also happen in other ceremonies. There's a number of other ceremonies where women have it's not just young boys. Women have these designs painted on their bodies, and other older people. It's not just in the just that's one context.
Yeah, sure. I was mentioning as one example. Yeah.
You know, the age grading, but there are lots of other ceremonies where women have designs painted on their body, and older people. Yeah.
So the bark paintings and the body paintings are songs made visual. Yes.
Yes, and in
So,
fact, yeah, it's best. That's how the visual art is to be seen in motion.
yeah.
In motion, so it's to be being performed. It's being danced with. Yeah.
And so,
It's
here's an interesting thing. And here's an interesting thing. So if you lost the songs, which was all part of assimilation, if you lost the songs, you only have the bark paintings left, right? So this idea that of the recovery of the songs, getting back to the songs is really critical, because that is the knowledge center. And I know that that's what we have a very similar experience in North America, where so many of the objects that are in museums are without their songs. So the people are trying to connect the songs with the to get it back. So the objects can not continue, but they have life. You give them the life back. And so, and I think that it's an interesting thing that you're saying. I really enjoy it. Thank you.
And I have also enjoyed this fantastic conversation. We're probably out of time right now, but I do want to thank you for this richly textured and substantial discussion about, teaching us that Indigenous art is more than art, and curation can be more than curation. So thank you very much for those listening, and thank you very much to my panelists today. So on behalf of the Power Institute, thank you very much.